In recent months, the committee has held 3 hearings, 2 with Commissioner Werfel, 1 with Secretary Yellen, in which Republicans have attacked the Inflation Reduction Act funding for the IRS. The first bill that the House Republicans passed in 2023 repealed the bulk of the funding. Repeal is the centerpiece of Senator McCarthy's default plan, which would also destroy 780,000 jobs and increase the odds of a recession. By all outward appearances, repealing this funding is the Republicans' top economic priority. That's why the Finance Committee meets this morning, to break down point by point all the harm repealing would do, especially as part of the overall McCarthy plan. First, I'd like to focus on the major setback for criminal law enforcement. As a way to frighten typical taxpayers, Republicans have fabricated a whole score of stories about 87,000 armed agents busting down the doors at local businesses and people's homes. This is nonsense. The truth is, the IRS has a modest but critically important team of law enforcement personnel. They work on busting human trafficking rings, drug cartels, and enablers of child exploitation. They root out individuals and groups who finance the terrorists. They help crack down on criminal tax fraud and evasion, including the kind of evasion the Finance Committee identified with our 2-year investigation of how Swiss bank Credit Suisse enabled a group of dual U.S. and foreign citizens to cheat on paying U.S. taxes. At the moment, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division is working with partners in Ukraine to hunt down crooks who are evading sanctions on Russia. Recently, the criminal investigation collaborated with the FBI, the Department of Justice, and law enforcement partners around the world on the largest fentanyl distribution takedown in history. It resulted in hundreds of arrests and the seizure of $54 million and 850 kilograms of drugs, including the equivalent of millions of lethal doses of fentanyl. Republican cuts reduced the workforce of criminal investigation special agents by 26%. Democrats passed IRA funding to help rebuild it, but Republicans now wish to repeal those funds. Others say that the funding ought to be targeted elsewhere. So, to me, the question is, colleagues, if you want to cut this enforcement spending, which criminal activity do you propose letting slide? Drug rings, money laundering, sex trafficking, and child abuse? Yesterday, addressing this issue, the committee received a letter from the Federal Law Enforcement Officer Association opposing the Republican plan. This is a group representing tens of thousands of federal law enforcement officers from across dozens of agencies. Without objection, I'll put that into the hearing record. Second issue, coming off the smoothest tax filing season in many years, the McCarthy repeal plan would once again clobber taxpayer service and force Americans to spend hours waiting on hold with all that music in the IRS. House Republicans are hiding the ball on this issue. The McCarthy plan would leave the temporary IRA funding for taxpayer service in place, and Republicans will insist that's proof that they're interested in maintaining better service. Here's what the Republicans aren't telling the American people. The McCarthy plan would also hit the IRS with across-the-board budget cuts, just like the ones that steadily wrecked taxpayer service before Democrats were able to start fixing things last year. Nobody is asking for a return to 10 or 15% call response rates at the IRS. Third, the McCarthy plan to repeal the IRS funding would lead to a $120 billion increase in the deficit. How would this plan offset the deficit increase? By kicking people off their health insurance, increasing child hunger, worsening education, weakening border security, and those are just a few of the examples. With that said, if you want to see who the big winners are of the McCarthy IRS defunding plan, it's billionaires and corporations who cheat on their taxes. The Inflation Reduction Act funding for the IRS was designed to make sure everybody paid what they owe. Repealing that funding is a $191 billion giveaway to wealthy tax cheats. The effect of Republican IRS cuts has been clear. From 2010 to 2017, when Republicans cut most aggressively in terms of the IRS, audit rates for millionaires went down 77%. For large corporations, 44%. For complex partnerships, down 80%. Performing those audits takes a lot of hard work, by skilled staff, and the IRS has lost 40% of those agents. Republican cuts shifted the burden of tax enforcement onto working people. That's because auditing them is easy. An audit of a simple individual's taxpayer return takes 5 hours on average. Auditing a higher income tax cheat takes an average of 250 hours. Corporate audits and audits of large complex partnerships can take even longer, sometimes several years. They require big teams with lots of expertise. Republican budget cuts systematically dismantled much of that expertise in the previous decade, and the McCarthy plan would decimate it in the years ahead. I'll close by saying the McCarthy plan, in my view, will lead to more tax evasion by the very, very wealthy. Worse taxpayer service for law-abiding Americans, and especially, colleagues, this is why I documented example after example, fewer prosecutions of drug cartel members, sex criminals, sanctions evaders, and money launderers. There's not a member I know of who supports those objectives, but that's what is really involved here. Lots to discuss. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. Senator Thune is our ranking member today. We always like working with him. Senator Thune.